lens flares are so f***ing cool. Even though they're cool, there's a chance that they are overused, making them less cool.
There are times when I'm working on a shot, I think, oh, this would be really cool. There's a lens flare.
This aesthetic thing that I like, which I absolutely am guilty of overusing.
We don't want to be creating uncool lens flares, do we? And how do we identify each part of the flare if we're trying to mitigate or boost it? This is my goal here. In this module, we're talking about optics to equip you with a vocabulary that is at least a little bit richer than "this lens has character" and "I love streak flares." DZO is our sponsor, and I'm using their Vespids and Pavos to help with examples. But we'll see plenty of other lenses too, and a lot of flares. By the end of this episode, you will understand the relationship between lens flares and lens coatings, as well as a lot more that goes in between. This knowledge gives you creative control over the texture and overall je ne sais quoi of your images, just to use a term that means I can't find words for it. The divide between clean and textured images is a timeless one. Some cinematographers, like Sir Roger Deakins, chase optical perfection, while others just love the opposite, choosing lenses that will bring about as many aberrations as they can to help create the visual language of their story. Regardless of which side of the spectrum you're on, I make the case that we all need to understand lens flares, how they come to be physically, and how they came to be historically. Lens flares are much more than streaks and blobs of light. They are the signature of how a lens digests direct lighting. Understanding them gives you power to eliminate them entirely or make them a defining part of your project's look, moving them from the accidental choices to purposeful ones. It's going to be a bouncy ride, and we'll start in reverse gear. Back in the late 1930s and early 40s, cinematographer Greg Toland was pioneering deep focus photography on Citizen Kane. His goal was to push forward Orson Welles' concept of visual flow. The scenes and sequences should flow together so smoothly that the audience would not be conscious of the mechanics of picture making. No technicality should stand in the way. No jarring cuts. In fact, no cuts if they could manage. And absolutely no optical imperfections. In an American cinematographer article, Toland explains how they achieved it. We were using lenses treated with the Vard Opticoat non-glare coating. So far, I have found this treatment not only beneficial, but durable. Depending upon the design of the lens to which it is applied, it gives an increase in speed ranging between half a stop and a stop, while at the same time giving a very marked increase in definition due to the elimination of flare and internal reflections. Lens coatings were just emerging, and he embraced them to push clarity further than anyone had before. This kind of visual clarity was the rule for a couple of decades, but the pendulum always swings. By the late 1960s, cameras had become silent, small, and light, creating the context for the French New Wave. Filmmakers were trying hard to show their films were not made in a box or in a studio. They were out on location using natural lighting, and flares, instead of a studio nuisance, became an indicator that the filmmakers were being authentic. Not only flares, but a lot of imperfections. I will focus on flares to try and stay on topic. These imperfections gave texture to the visuals. In the documentary Visions of Light, The Art of Cinematography, Conrad Hall, responsible for the look of Cool Hand Luke, expands on his role at the time.
I feel particularly involved in helping make mistakes acceptable. If the light shone in the lens and flared the lens, that was considered a mistake. Somebody would report that, the operator would report, the sun hit the lens, it flared the lens, it cut.
Before the end of the decade, the trend had already quickly spread to Easy Rider, The Graduate, Planet of the Apes, among others, where flares, halation, and glass texture became part of the film's visual style. They were proof the movies were not made in a box. Ironically, the camera is a box, but we get it. As filmmakers started embracing these imperfections, Anamorphics had a lot to contribute with their signature streak flares. As anamorphic lenses provided more immersion through a larger screen and a wider aspect ratio, certain genres enthusiastically adopted them, namely epics and sci-fi, with great flare examples in E.T., Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Alien, Blade Runner, and the list goes on. With so many classics featuring them, streak flares are indeed one of the key traits of the anamorphic look, with many filmmakers actively pursuing them as ways to add layers to their visuals. As cinema entered the digital era, flares found another purpose. Computer-generated imagery is mathematically perfect. Kind of, let's just assume. Which looks artificial, and it stands out from the imperfect world around us and the worlds in our films. Adding flares and aberrations has helped blend CGI elements with the fallibility of real optics. Ironically, while flares are a result of the physical existence of lenses, when given the option of not having those physical consequences, in animation for example, something feels amiss. In opposition to Greg Toland's beliefs, the language of cinema speaks through its apparatus, cameras, and lenses, and the emotions conveyed through their constraints extend their influence to the realm of animation. To name a few, Spider-Verse, Onward, and Encanto all simulate flares to mimic how light interacts with real lenses. In other words, digital artists are recreating optical imperfections on purpose because that is what our eyes associate with cinematic realism. This is just a snippet on the topic of cinematography for animation, and if you want to learn more, check out my video on the subject. But if we lean on it too hard, on lens flares,
There's a lens flare.
we get to J.J. Abrams' Star Trek in 2009. The flare renaissance. By that point, lens flares were not seen as technical flaws anymore. They were stylistic tools. Abrams pushed it even further in Star Trek in 2013 to great criticism. Here's a snippet of a Tribeca interview between Chris Rock and J.J. Abrams on the topic of flares to move us to our next point.
What's up with the lens flares? What's up with all the lens flares?
All right.
That's your thing.
No, here's the thing. I'm over that. I'm not saying there will never be a flare in anything I do, but for a period of time on Star Trek, there was this idea we had that was that the future was so bright that it just couldn't be contained. And that you had stuff happening, so it felt like just off camera there was something great. And I overdid it. And then I went further. And then on the second Star Trek movie, I went nuts. And we literally would have flashlights. They weren't put in post. We would have flashlights off camera, these insane high-powered flashlights. And we would do the thing that every director of photography is like, don't do that. We aimed it right in the lens. And when there was a lens that had like a glare coating on it to not flare, we wouldn't use it.
So, what causes a lens to flare? Well, every time light passes through a surface, like from air into glass, a small fraction, about 4% of it, reflects out instead of going through. Multiply that by every element inside of a lens, and these little reflections start to add up. Some light bounces back and forth between elements, some of it bounces off the aperture blades, some reflects off the metal inside of the housing, endless possibilities. A flare is the visible result of all that light bouncing inside of the lens. Different lenses produce different types of flares. And to help us talk about flares in the future, let's get into a breakdown of flare elements. Knowing their names and origins allows you to both fight them off more effectively as well as achieve them more easily. So let's bring in the lenses and start with ghosts. Ghosts, or spot flares, happen when light from a bright source reflects off one or more internal glass surfaces and lands on the sensor as images of those elements. The spot flares often mirror the aperture shape that produced them, leading to a common misconception in which people call ghosts bokeh. Aside from the starburst around the light, ghosts are what most people imagine when they hear lens flares. Circle spot flares frequently show up in many different colors. These colors are coating dependent, and we'll talk about that shortly. Coatings determine which colors are reflected and which colors go through. Some ghosts have a teardrop shape that changes as the light crosses the frame, and those are called caustic flares. They are caused by light coming into the lens at steep angles. Last, if you have really bright light sources in your frame, it is possible to see ghosts shaped like the light sources. This is particularly common with night shots and car headlights, or when the sun is in the frame. Rainbow flares, or eyelashes, are caused by stray light hitting exposed metal or other surfaces inside of the lens, or hitting element edges. These rays of light can scatter and show a striated, colorful texture reflected into the image. They aren't always so colorful and can look like irregular streaks or barrel shapes. Rainbow flares usually only show up at the fastest stop of a lens and tend to disappear once you close the iris even a little bit. Ring flares are also created by element edges or the rim of the barrel of the lens. If the edges of a lens element are not blackened, light can bounce on it, creating these Photoshop-like lens flares with a perfect circle around the light source. Narcissism is when light scatters and reflects on some part of the image capturing apparatus, the lens or the sensor, and ends up in the final image. For example, your sensor stack, your optical low-pass filter or infrared filters. The light bounces from the stack to the rear of the lens and then into your sensor, revealing any patterns or textures present there. The first time that I saw this, I thought I'd broken the camera. Upon direct light hitting the lens, filming with a red several years ago, I started to see lots of very clear red dots all over the image. They would only show up with direct light. This type of reflection can vary from camera to camera depending on the filter stack recipe. Starbursts, or aperture diffraction, if we want to use the technical name, come from light bending around each individual blade of the iris. An odd number of blades will lead to twice the number of spikes, and an even number of blades leads to that same number of spikes because the bursts overlap with the opposite side. These are further affected by your aperture size and blade shape. Anamorphic streaks are created by the cylindrical anamorphic elements, which stretch and smear light along one axis. Multiple internal reflections and coating interactions create long, colored streaks. If you want to show off, whenever you're watching a film and you spot this diagonal pattern on an anamorphic flare, you can tell your friends, "I know this was shot on Panavision." Those diagonal streaks are made by Panavision's counter-rotating astigmatizer, used for changing focus. Glow isn't really a flare element, but I will include it here. We usually see glow around bright or overexposed elements in the frame. The glow originates from that strong light scattering as it goes through the lens, softly lifting the black levels around the bright element. If you think of filters like mist or glimmer glass, all they do is induce different levels of light scattering, which softens the image. Halation is something that could be assumed part of lens flares, but instead is a subtle effect that us, digital people, worked very hard to recreate. as it gives the images a very organic look. Halation is caused by the bouncing of light from the overexposed areas in the frame between the film's different layers, and it usually manifests itself in the form of reddish-orange halos. Nothing to do with lenses, but still everything to do with light bouncing around. Gate flares are also not created by the lens, but are some of the most common flares in my experience. These are spike-like flares that you get when a light source is edging the frame, and the intensity is just enough to flash at the edge of the sensor. In the film days, this would be even more intense as the gate that held the film in place was made of silvery metal. Last, veiling flare is best described by covering the image with a veil of light, leading to elevated black levels, loss of contrast, color, and even shape over the frame. Veiling glare usually shows up as a white wash of the image, and if we're looking at the bright side of things, it can really help with a dreamy look. It's very common when framing very strong light sources or very large ones. Each of these flare elements contribute to the fingerprint of a lens. On top of that, all of these elements are affected by the positioning of the originating light source as well as the lens's aperture setting. And since we're talking about aperture versus flares, I wanted to show a really unique flare from the Super Baltar 35mm. If you have the lens wide open, it's a regular flare, but when stopping it down, we get this full-on ghost of the aperture blades reflected into the image. This happens because the blades are not coated in a matte material, and the light that bounces off of them successfully travels all the way back to the sensor. As we saw earlier, this effect is called Narcissism. This last example came from a chat with Marcus Forderer, ASC, about cine flares. If you want to study flares even further, that is the largest flare sample library out there. Cine Flares makes it super easy to compare flare characteristics between different lenses. This is a powerful tool if featuring or obscuring flares is important to your story, as you can do a lot of research ahead of your practical tests. Now let's talk about lens coatings. By definition, coatings are ultra-thin, precisely engineered layers applied to the glass element surfaces in a lens to control how light interacts with them. Before we fall into the cliche and misconception of, I prefer lenses with less coatings, modern-day cinematography is inseparable from lens coating technology. Good coatings increase transmission efficiency, effectively making lenses faster as less light gets bounced around and more light reaches the sensor. It allows for the use of more glass elements to refine the optical design, it reduces flares and ghosting, and it boosts contrast and color accuracy. If anti-reflective coatings had not evolved, our high-contrast lighting setups of today would look nothing like they do. Coatings are key to how we can shape and capture light through our lenses. Here I am borrowing a lot of Sikala's Reflections on Reflections article on Lens Rental's blog. Go check it out if you want even more on coatings. In the early 1900s, most lens designs were made up of 4 to 6 glass elements. This is not a limit imposed by the designer's math capabilities or the lens maker's polishing skill. They already knew that more elements meant better corrections of aberrations. What they could not fight yet was the up to 4% loss of light per surface in the design due to reflections, creating a web of internal reflections that wrecked contrast. Let's visualize what this means with a simple 6-element design. This means that we have 12 glass-air transitions, 2 per element, or group in some cases. Each one of these transitions scatters or absorbs 4% of the light, letting the remainder pass. So out of the total light coming in, only 61.3% of it makes it to the other side. Discounting how these reflections wash out contrast and looking only at the light transfer, we are losing almost one full stop of light. And a more complex design with more elements, like a zoom lens with dozens of elements, loses even more. To make matters worse, before the turn of the century, two dudes, Lord Rayleigh, the same one who outlined the Rayleigh criterion, the proof that any lens has a limit to how much detail it can resolve, and Dennis Taylor, yes, the designer of the Cooke triplet lens. They both noticed something related to the matter. Rayleigh and Taylor noticed that old, slightly tarnished lenses that were sitting on their shelves actually transmitted more light than the brand new, just polished ones. The thin oxidized layer of sediment acted like a primitive coating. Yet, neither of them knew how to replicate it intentionally. It was only in 1935 that Alexander Zmakula at Zeiss cracked it. He developed and patented a fairly simple process to apply an anti-reflective coating to lenses, reducing those pesky reflections by about 80% per glass element. If we place 1935 on a timeline, we know World War II is coming up, and this discovery remained a military secret. It is also the reason why German binoculars were so coveted by the Allied forces. They performed so much better. So when Greg Toland talks about the Vard Opticoat used in Citizen Kane, he was gaining around one free stop of light from using the coating, as opposed to the same lenses without it. Here's our earlier example, adjusted for the new coating. By the 1960s, coatings were cutting reflections by 90%, and by the 90s, it was 99%. Today, we're even better at it. Lens designers could finally add more glass without ruining the image. That meant faster lenses, higher resolving power, and better correction of chromatic aberration. It is not an exaggeration to say coatings enabled modern lens design. If we never had coatings, zoom lenses would be effectively impossible to make. Diving a bit further into how coatings work, the core principle at play is refraction. Each medium, air, water, glass, crystal, dish soap, has a different refractive index. The difference between the refractive indexes affects how light will bend when transitioning between mediums. A single coat works by bridging the refractive index difference between air and glass. Air is roughly 1.0 and glass is around 1.5. That 0.5 gap is where reflections happen. A coating is a medium with a refractive index somewhere in between 1 and 1.5. Think of it as an optical stepping stone for the light wave. For example, the tarnish on the lens observed by Rayleigh and Taylor, or Zmakula's original coating, had a refractive index of 1.25, right in between 1 and 1.5. This half step meant losing only a quarter of the light that we lost previously. And this is a gross mathematical oversimplification. Most optical glass, like crown glass, has a refractive index around 1.52. The ideal anti-reflective coating would have an index near 1.23, but no solid material fits that bill. The best compromise is magnesium fluoride at about 1.38. The magnesium fluoride layer on glass can reduce reflection from 4% down to 1%. It performs even better on higher index glass. It is cheap and stable and durable, which is why it has been the standard for decades. But coatings are not just chemistry, they're also quantum physics. Coatings can work through destructive interference. Light reflecting from the coating surface is slightly out of phase with the reflection from the glass beneath. The two waves cancel each other out, reducing visible reflection. The magic happens in the thickness of the coating, usually a fraction of a wavelength of visible light. Make it just right, and reflections vanish for one color of light. And we know light is made up of a multitude of colors, and that's how multi-coatings take destructive interference even further. By stacking several layers, each tuned to a different wavelength, you get suppression across the entire visible spectrum. Some advanced coatings even form a continuous refractive gradient, so light passes through almost seamlessly. This is why multi-coated lenses have such clean, high-contrast images, and why their flares are typically more controlled with lesser ghosts and haze. You know the color that we see when tilting a lens and catching those reflections? Purple, green, blue?
Yeah! Blue, yellow, pink! Whatever, man, just keep bringing me that.
Different wavelengths of light are suppressed or reflected more strongly depending on the thickness and composition of the coatings. So the colors that you see on your lens are the colors that are not being passed onto the film or sensor. For example, if I use a lens that has a super strong blue coating, like this Gallius 44 marked with the red P, the image comes out super warm. Yep, coatings also define how lenses render color. It was only in 1986 that Panavision developed a process to match coatings across all elements in their Primo lenses, ensuring the entire set shared identical color response. Before that, across all manufacturers, lenses from the same series could shift hue from one focal length to another. This thing of color-consistent sets is relatively new. In contrast, the color of coatings is definitely the color that shows up in your flares. On the topic of anamorphics, for example, if you spot blue-toned coatings on your cylindrical elements, you can bet on a cool-toned flare. Another example, green flares, are common because coatings protect magenta wavelengths to preserve natural skin tones on the images. If you had to pick between natural skin tones and green flares, or unnatural skin tones and gorgeous flares, what would you pick? Actually, don't answer that question. I don't want to know. Because we like to look and compare things, let's repeat the analysis of DZO's regular Vespid lens, now in contrast to their Vespid Retro series. The difference comes from the cumulative optical chemistry across multiple coated surfaces. I started with the Vespid 75mm, shining a 300-watt light straight down the barrel. Surprisingly, we see almost no flaring. The most noticeable flare element is the starburst around the light itself, and since the iris has 16 blades, we have 16 spikes. By stopping it down to T5.6, we see a very slight improvement in contrast, but its source is hard to pinpoint to anything other than veiling flare, which we can notice when I pan the light back onto the lens. As I switch to the 75 Retro, we immediately notice the image is washed in a warm veiling flare from the coating color. We also see circle spot flares and caustics across the frame, mostly in orange tones, again like the coatings. We see very mild rainbow ghosts near the corner of the frame and a rainbow Fresnel-like pattern. By repeating the process of stopping the lens down to T5.6, we see the rainbow pattern near the light source disappear around T4, and the ghosts reduce in size and acquire more accurate shapes. And as I pan the light out of the lens, the image actually becomes cooler in tones than the original Vespid, as the warm coatings are keeping out some of the warmer wavelengths. You might come across a variety of stories about removing coatings from lenses. I have done some of it myself on Soviet-era lenses, attacking Murs, Gallios, and Jupiter. Some more brave or reckless, like the folks at Media Division, talk about coating removal on anamorphic adapters. And a few Hollywood DPs talk about how they got their coatings removed by Panavision for a particular project. Removing or tweaking coatings is a messy process, and the results are hardly ever worth the sacrifice of the lens. You can take the coatings out easily, but you can never bring them back. Older coatings in particular have had their formulas lost to time or application processes long abandoned. Some of them might contain materials we no longer use in camera lenses due to their toxicity, and those old coatings are what make the resulting images special. You now understand that removing the coatings of any lens surface means a minimum sacrifice of 4% of your light. It also affects contrast, and you can see that clearly in my Soviet experiments, as well as the flares themselves. Equipped with this knowledge, which I didn't have when I polished all those lenses, I would strongly recommend that you do not polish your own lenses. Leave it for when you make it big in Hollywood, and you can ask Dan Sasaki to do it for you. If you must experiment in this direction, I recommend using very cheap lenses, taking meticulous notes, and being accepting of unexpected outcomes. I mean, some of these results that Nicholas at Media Division got are pretty neat compared to the original, but the only way to know so is by taking out the coatings. Flares are the visible trace of physics, design, and history. The same coating technology that lets us make a clean, contrasty image is also what shapes the beauty of a flare when we choose to embrace it. So whether you are chasing the precision of Toland, the organic flares of the 70s, or the overwhelming streaks of Star Trek, understanding the why behind lens flares gives you control. You can do flares just because they are cool, but it is much cooler when you can explain that choice or ascribe a meaning to your flares. In the next episode, we will talk about bokeh. It is another wild buzzword, and it's time to give it a bit more shape, pun intended. Now go catch some flares. You look like you need some vitamin D. DZOFILM out.